there, I am Sharon and welcome to Color Girl Quilts. I am glad you tuned in to join me today. Our video today is going to be all about pressing your quilt pieces, so your patchwork squares, your binding strips, and I especially want to focus today on using a pressed wool mat. Lately, I have been working on some small-scale piecing projects, specifically paper foundation piecing. And if you've done that sort of piecing before, you know it's a lot of back and forth between the sewing machine and the ironing board. So I wanted to get a smaller pressing mat that I could set up right on my table with a cutting mat, a pressing pad, and my sewing machine all close together so that I could just go back and forth between sewing and pressing really easily. And I got a wool pressing mat from a company called Lilypad Lake. These are sold on Amazon, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about it. Lilypad Lake is sponsoring this video and wanted to hear my thoughts on what I liked about the mat, to tell you all a little bit about how to care for it, what it's good for, why wool pressing mat is good for you, for quilters. And so that's what we are going to do today. Okay, so first a couple of things about the mat itself. I just took it out of its package to set up today, and one of the things on the instructions says to heat up your iron and use a pressing cloth on the mat initially and press it all to get it nice and warm and primed. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I've got my iron really very hot. And it also said in the instructions, one of the things to think about if you're using steam with your pressing, that you don't need to use very much. The fibers of the wool will absorb some of the moisture, and if you use too much, it will soak through to your table underneath. So something to think about. I actually saved the little cellophane package that the mat came in, and I just went ahead and put it under my mat to protect my sewing table just in case. I'm not using any steam, and I don't usually with my pressing. But I'm just going to give my pressing cloth a good press and kind of get my mat warmed up. It's already super smooth, so it's not that it needs to be pressed per se, but the instructions said to give it a good pressing one time with a pressing cloth. So we have that done. You'll see that the surface of the wool is really smooth. So that makes it nice, of course, for pressing pieces, particularly small pieces, because they stay flat, and that's what you want in quilting, is for things to be really nice and flat. And I'm told that the Lilypad Lake mats won't pill or develop like rough spots or get rubbed spots and create texture, so that's really nice. But one of the things that I have noticed about the mat, that even though it's really smooth, it holds your pieces in place really nicely when you're pressing. So if I want to press something and keep it really flat, it doesn't, the fabrics grip the wool and don't slip around. Another thing that's pretty neat about it is that the wool absorbs some of the heat. So you can actually end up having like a heat source below your fabric pieces as well as the iron on top. So you're going to get really nice crisp seams when you do your pressing. So something that's an important thing to remember when you're pressing patchwork is that you want to press versus iron. So we aren't sliding the iron over the fabric. That can cause stretching, particularly on pieces that are sewn together where the seams can come apart or your shapes can get distorted. Okay, so I'm just going to show as a quick example. I have some little postage stamp blocks here, and a good technique for pressing any type of patchwork piecing is to first put the hot iron down on your fabric, okay? And you can lift it up and put it back down so that you're pressing rather than sliding. And then take your piece, and in this case I'm pressing my seams open. So I'm going to open my sewing, lay it flat, and slide my finger in that seam. And the nice thing, the reason that we put the iron down on it first is to warm up the fabric and make it a little bit more pliable. Take some of the heat, and if you're using steam, the steam will do this too, but the heat helps to kind of release the fibers and soften up the fabric so that when you go to press, you can get a nice crisp seam. Okay, so as you can see, these really stay put. It's not sliding around on the mat, and I can just put my iron down, and once I've got that seam kind of opened up, then I'll turn it over and press from the front, and this is where it's going to get really nice and flat. Okay, so I recommend using this technique for all of your patchwork pieces to help reduce with distortion of your shapes, so that when you go to sew your next pieces together, they are still the size that you want, and the edges are nice and straight. Another little detail about the cutting mat is that it is 100% New Zealand wool. It's a 1/2 inch thick, and it's packed really densely. Lilypad Lake tells me that they pack their fibers so tightly, and they don't include any fillers or anything other than the wool. So the mats stay nice and firm, they stay in their original shape, and they don't get compressed. Because you can imagine if you're doing a lot of pressing, particularly like if you're using one spot and pressing things a lot on it, you may start to get an indentation or a wave in the mat. That's not going to happen with these because they are so tightly woven and include only the wool. They also don't have any dyes, so you don't have to worry about anything getting on your fabric or seeping into your table because of the moisture from steam or anything like that. So they're really pure. It's just all wool, and they're really pretty, and they feel really good. And honestly, the thing that I like the best of it, and maybe this is really simple, is just how convenient it is. It's nice and small rather than having to have a full-size ironing board to fold up and find a place to put it. I can just have this one right here on my table, and when I'm finished with it, put it onto a shelf or slip it under the table very easily. So now I'm going to, if I can find the end, I will do my binding strips. I always cut my binding strips on the bias angle for the ends and sew them together that way so that you have less bulk. For those of you who are interested in learning the full process of binding your quilts, there is a video on Color Girl Quilts YouTube that's all about binding. I will show you the steps from start to finish and give you a couple of different methods so that you have options. You can decide which one works the best for your skill level and preference. Okay, so my binding strips are cut on the bias at the ends. So I will go through and press those seams open. Again, with binding strips, you want to reduce the bulk of fabric on the edges of your quilt as much as possible so that you get a nice smooth edge. So press your seams open and then fold your strip in half lengthwise and press it really well. Now for this, I want a really strong crease. I'm going to turn my iron up slightly and get it really, really hot. And this might be a place where you want to use steam. Now with binding strips, I cut these on the straight of grain. But if you're using bias cut strips, you definitely want to make sure that you're using the lift and place technique with your iron so that you're not stretching your bias strips. And I'm going to work my way along my binding strip and continue to press that so that I get a nice sharp crease and a nice smooth strip. Okay, so first impressions of my new wool mat. Like I said before, I love the convenience of it, that I can just have it on a tabletop. Lilypad Lake sells several sizes. I actually got the biggest one that they have. So this one is 17 inches by 24 inches. They also have like small square ones and smaller rectangular ones, but they're all pretty nice tabletop size. So I like this kind of medium, larger one to use for larger things like binding and maybe like whole quilt blocks. But you could also have a smaller one just to have next to your sewing machine for, like I said before, that quick back and forth for little paper piecing projects and smaller patchwork. I noticed as I was ironing that it does get warm. The mat itself gets really nice and hot as you're ironing. So I can see what they mean by creating kind of a dual surface, that it is retaining heat so that your piece is getting that much extra pressing action, that much extra heat in order to create nice smooth creases and fabric. So I'm thinking these could also be handy for non-quilters if you have a small space like a dorm room, or you just need to press like the collar on your shirt or something like that. It'd be really handy for that. But I'm going to keep working on my binding strips and get them ready to sew on my quilt. So thank you for tuning in with me today and talking about pressing matters, and I hope that this gave you a little bit of an idea why these wool pressing mats have been so popular lately. All right, till next time, happy sewing.